To build on your experience, Joe, I'm curious for listeners who are trying to focus optimally or trying to use their cognition to solve big problems and accomplish big things and focus for prolonged periods and get into flow, but feel that something physiologically is not quite right, or that maybe they don't have the focus they used to. Are there a litany of sort of most common issues that may be causing decreased cognitive function, whether it's mold, whether it's, gut issues like Crohn's? I'm curious what the sort of first bucket of common things that get skipped by, a conventional physical are that may be decreasing cognitive performance in folks.
I love this because I'm such a fan of your work in flow, and I really feel like we can all get into these superhuman states of just by harnessing the power of flow. But we talked briefly before we came on, and the difficulty is when there's something physiological that's affecting your brain or your nervous system, you can do all the right things, or you maybe have gotten into flow before and been very proficient at it, and then all of a sudden you come to a standstill, right? And what I didn't tell you, and I'll tell you very briefly, is I went after the breast cancer and Crohn's for 12 years, really healthy, doing great, moved to Boulder, started my practice. And then in 2013, there was a massive flood of epidemic proportions in Boulder called the 1,000-year flood. And a year later, I started having brain fog, trouble focusing, concentrating, memory issues, a little bit of, I'm not a depressed or anxious person by nature, but I had more like anxiety, feeling overwhelmed easily, maybe what you'd call borderline even depression. And I knew something was going on. And to make a long story short, I found mold in the basement of my office, the nasty black Stachybotrys and Cotomium. And I took a fast track course in mold and had to become a mold expert to heal myself again. And it really, more than anything else I've ever experienced, cancer was a cakewalk compared to mold. Because it's insidious. It takes away your insight, which means your ability to understand what's actually happening in real time. It affects your cognition. And there's a real, I don't think there's anything spiritual about it, but there's a real dark heaviness about it that makes you feel like lack of motivation, overwhelmed easily, like you can't, and you don't really, even though now I know when I'm exposed to mold, there's still a weirdness about that insight. And as I studied to write my book, Rian, I was amazed to see there's literally PubMed studies on the chemical inhalation of something like mycotoxins and the effect on the limbic system, which we'll talk about today. So there's literally not just because what I've always thought is there's this fear thing that happens when you've been exposed to mold, you know how sick it can make you, and that activates the limbic system. And so then all of a sudden, if you get a re-exposure, you get this trauma, like a PTSD effect on the brain and the body. That's real because you have this memory of what happened before, but it's actually beyond that. It's not just our psychology, or if we haven't done our work around trauma, it's literally a physiological, the inhalation receptors on the hypothalamic pituitary axis directly related to limbic activation happens just purely from the chemical. And this, when I read this, was like, this is it. This is why, because 100% of people who've had mold exposure have some piece of trauma and limbic overactivation, even if, like you and I, we've done our work, we know our stuff, we know the stuff so well, and yet there's a chemical trauma trigger. That's fascinating to me. Now I've digressed, but I wanted to share that because I've been through mold and I had to figure it out. And now I have become a mold expert, but only by like survival. I had to understand this, and it is the most nasty thing I've ever experienced. And if I had to pick one thing that is most likely to inhibit your flow, it is toxic mold, without a doubt. There's no doubt.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.